Welcome to Evolving Humans. I'm your host, Julia Marie. If you've ever sensed there's more to you and to reality than what you've been taught, this show is for you. We explore consciousness in a grounded, practical way, how human awareness is changing, what ideas like Christ consciousness or past lives really point to, and how all of that connects to the choices you make every day. No dogma, no jargon, just honest, down-to-earth conversations to help you live from a deeper knowing as we walk this path of awareness together. In this series on Evolving Humans, we've been exploring Christ consciousness from a few different angles. First, we looked at it within the larger context of the history of consciousness as far as humanity's development. And then we took a look at Jesus outside of religion and belief and the dark night of the soul as part of our spiritual journey. Today I want to take a look at it from a different perspective, the perspective of psychology. Now, for some people, that might raise some alarm bells like, are we reducing something sacred to simple brain chemistry? My answer would be no. Or are we turning Christ into an archetype or a metaphor? Not exactly. My intention today is to ask if there really is such a thing as the mind of Christ, how does it actually show up in a human psyche and in a human nervous system? Because the bottom line is, if Christ consciousness doesn't change how our inner world is structured, then it stays an abstraction or a belief instead of a lived reality. True understanding, real wisdom, comes only through experience. Today I'll describe Christ consciousness in simple psychological terms. I'll talk about ego, the deeper self, and the Christ pattern. Then I'll name some common distortions, and finally, I'll guide you through a short self-reflection so you can have your own experience. First, some context. I see Christ consciousness as a level of awareness, so to speak, so when I use the phrase Christ consciousness, what am I actually talking about? From a psychological perspective, we could describe it as a mode of awareness that has some distinct or recognizable qualities. For example, in this state, one experiences more inner space and less self-preoccupation. One's ability to be compassionate is present even when things are hard. There's a commitment to truth, but not in a harsh or weaponized way. And there's a greater ability to hold paradox and not knowing without collapsing into anxiety. Let's take a moment to compare that to our more familiar, everyday state of being. Usually we're highly self-protective. In other words, we worry about how we look and whether we're right or if we're in control. We see other people mostly as threats, competitors, or supporting characters in our story. Now, in the Christian tradition, there are some familiar phrases like, we have the mind of Christ, Christ in you. Instead of hearing these as simply theology, we can also hear them, again, from a psychological perspective. The center of gravity for consciousness is shifting when we're in that state or moving into that state of Christ consciousness, from the place of a small, defended and defensive I to a deeper, more open, loving, and accepting center. Christ consciousness, in this sense, is what it feels like when that deeper center begins to manage more of our thoughts, emotions, and behavior. Now, to make this a little more understandable, I want to describe a basic map of this inner world. We can think in terms of 3 layers or levels of functioning here. First, the persona, or the surface self. This includes our roles and our masks. For example, parent, partner, professional, or maybe the spiritual one or the strong one. Our persona represents how we want to be seen. It's not fake, but we do tend to curate it. The second layer would be the ego or the organizer. This is the part of us that keeps life coherent and relatively safe. The ego tracks things like who am I, what do I need, how do I stay okay. The ego is formed from our early experiences, attachment patterns, and culture. It's not the enemy, but it is limited and often fear-based in its operation. The third layer in this map would be the deeper self, often also called the true self. This is a deeper center of awareness that is capable of being a witness to our thoughts and emotions. The true self is more stable than mood or role, and it naturally tends towards love, truth, and connection. According to the famous Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, this is the archetype of the self. In Christian mysticism, this is the level where Christ dwells, where, as Meister Eckhart puts it, the ground of the soul and the ground of God are one. In this model of psychological growth, it's not about killing the ego. It's about softening ego's grip and allowing it to be re-educated. We can then gradually shift our sense of I from the defensive ego into that deeper, more Christ-like center. The Apostle Paul said, "It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me." From the psychological perspective, we might understand that our small anxious self is no longer running the show, and that our sense of I is rooted in a deeper, God-shaped self. I want to take a few moments to look at the life of Christ as a story, and then search for the psychological pattern that is evident within that story. And when we do this, hopefully we can see that the life of Christ begins to look like a map of consciousness in the process of maturing. So let's start with the fact that Jesus incarnated. He took human form. From a psychological perspective, this would mean perhaps that we are not escaping the body or the world, but rather participating in it completely. If we look at the phase of Jesus' ministry, which was all about teaching, healing, and confronting hypocrisy and injustice, we could say from the psychological perspective, this is where our unique gifts begin to flow, and we start to question the systems and patterns that harm life. Jesus' passion and crucifixion was all about themes of betrayal, humiliation, abandonment, and death. Psychologically, this is the place where ego structures begin to break down and our image of ourself collapses. This is the dark night, or the deep dismantling, that was addressed in the Dark Night of the Soul episode. Then comes Jesus' resurrection, which represents a new kind of life on the other side of death. The psychological perspective is that identity is no longer rooted in fear or our image, but rather in a direct sense of being held by something larger. We have a love that has gone through death and is not destroyed by it. Finally, the Ascension and his continuing presence depicts Christ as a living, present reality. Psychologically, we perceive Christ consciousness as a field we can participate in, not just a figure from the past. When we hear phrases from the Christian tradition like put on Christ or be conformed to the image of Christ, we can hear that as an invitation to let this pattern work itself out in us and through us. In other words, to allow our false selves to be exposed, to let our ego structures die many small deaths, and to allow a deeper, freer, more loving, more wise self to take shape. So Christ, psychologically, is not just a historical figure out there, it's also an inner blueprint of what our humanity can become when it's aligned with love. Before we move to the exercise, let's address the problems of any powerful spiritual symbol or idea, including Christ consciousness, and how it can get twisted by the very ego it's meant to transform. So I want to name a few of the distortions that are possible with the concept of Christ consciousness. First, spiritual inflation. What do I mean? Well, this is when the ego grabs onto spiritual language to make itself feel superior. For example, I have Christ consciousness, or I'm more awakened than these other people. Here are some signs of spiritual inflation. The person is less open to feedback and perhaps has a subtle or even overt contempt for quote-unquote less evolved people. And often there's a sense of specialness that actually separates them from others. From the psychological point of view, it's the ego putting on Christ clothes without actually letting itself be crucified. The second distortion would be spiritual bypass. When this happens, ideas like oneness, forgiveness, or it's all love get thrown around a lot in order to avoid experiencing the grief, the anger, and the trauma. And it's often used as a way to avoid difficult conversations and boundaries. Here are some examples. Someone might say, "We're all one, so let's not talk about the harm that was done," or "I've forgiven them, so it's all good." All the time their body is still shaking. Psychology says this is a sign of unintegrated emotion and the shadow being covered over with a spiritual blanket. And the third thing to watch for is when dissociation is mistaken for transcendence. Sometimes what we call peace is actually numbness. In other words, it's a shutting down of feeling or a sense of being above it all, but actually, we're out of touch with our own bodies and hearts. It's more like a nervous system in freeze mode, not a heart that's genuinely open and grounded. Here's a simple litmus test for you. If your version of Christ consciousness makes you less honest, less embodied, or less accountable in relationships, it's probably not Christ consciousness. It's likely an ego strategy in spiritual clothing. I promised you a self-reflection exercise, and that's what's up next. Let's spend a few moments exploring Christ consciousness in your own experience. If you're driving or operating something, you might want to pause here and come back later when you can settle in and close your eyes safely. So I'm going to assume now as we begin this exercise that you're in a quiet place where you won't be disturbed. So go ahead. Pay attention to your breath, breathing in and breathing out. And as you focus on the rhythm of your breath, allow your eyes to gently close. Just notice the rising and the falling of your breath. And feel yourself, your feet on the ground, your back being supported. Allow the breath to relax your body and still your mind. Now bring to mind a recent situation where you felt defensive, hurt, or like you had to prove yourself. It could be a conversation, a conflict, an email, or even just something you saw on social media or the news. Notice what that sensation feels like in your body. Did your throat tighten? A jaw tense? Did you get a knot in your stomach? Or maybe have a sense of a buzzing or an emptiness? And notice the thoughts that tend to come with it. They don't get me. I always mess this up. I need to fix this right now. If this doesn't go my way, I'm not okay. See if you can silently say to this part of yourself, "Thank you for trying to protect me." You don't have to change it. Just acknowledge that this is your ego doing its job. Now allow your attention to widen a little. Imagine that beneath all of these reactions, there's a deeper place in you that can notice them, can observe them. You don't have to feel any dramatic shift. Just ask yourself, is there a part of me that is aware of all of this, but that I am not completely fused with? If it helps, just use your imagination to picture this deeper center. Perhaps it's a quiet, steady presence in your chest or your belly. An energy that isn't panicked, that doesn't need to defend, that simply sees. From this peaceful place, look again at that situation. Imagine viewing it from this deeper center rather than from your tight, reactive place. Now gently ask yourself, without forcing an answer, if I were responding from this deeper place, what might Christ-like love look like towards myself, toward the other person, toward the situation? Don't make a plan or judge yourself. Just allow the question to sink in. What would love look like? What would life look like from this deeper place? Now allow both aspects to be present with you in your awareness. The part of you that feels threatened or defensive, and this quieter, more spacious awareness. And if you want to, take a moment to imagine that quieter presence, placing a gentle hand on the shoulder of the frightened part and saying, "I see you. Thank you. You don't have to run the whole show by yourself. I am here." Take a breath. Now notice any small shift. Are you perhaps aware of a little more space around the feeling? Did your breathing soften? Or do you have a clearer vision of what's going on? Take a slightly deeper breath in and exhale. Feel your feet on the ground again and the support of your chair. Wiggle your fingers and toes as you come back to awareness of your breath moving in and out of your body. And when you're ready, gently open your eyes. What we just did is a very small, very human version of shifting from ego center to your Christ center, or your higher awareness, if you will. Not by rejecting your ego, but by allowing the ego to be held by this wiser aspect of your being. Maybe take a few moments to write in your journal any differences that you felt, any observations that you may have around this. That information is going to be valuable to you as you move forward. All right, so today we looked at Christ consciousness as a mode of awareness that's characterized by spaciousness, compassion, and truth. And we talked about the shift of identity from a small defended ego to a deeper self that Christian mystics would call the Christ within, and a psychological pattern of maturation that includes incarnation, death, and resurrection within the context of the psychological model. We learned the ego isn't bad or wrong. It's just not meant to be in charge all the time. The spiritual journey is about letting that deeper, Christ-like center slowly become the organizing principle of our inner life. And I've promised you a tool that you can use should you choose. So here's a simple practice you might want to play with during the coming weeks. Ask yourself one question about a recurring situation. What would it look like to pause and respond from that quieter, deeper center rather than from my first ego-driven reflex? When you notice yourself getting triggered, you're feeling defensive, hurt, or like you have to prove something, take a moment, pause, take 3 slow, deep breaths deep into your belly, and tell yourself, I am allowed to respond from a deeper place. The slowing down will heighten your self-awareness and open you to more of your inherent higher wisdom. Well, that's our time for today. Thank you for your continued support of Evolving Humans. If you found value in this episode, please share it with 2 other people so that together we can bring more light to this world. If you need guidance about a current life situation, want to reconnect with your loved ones living on the other side of life, or are in need of some energy healing, please go to my website, juliamarie.us, and click the Book Now button on the homepage. Until next time, give yourself some grace. Have some compassion for yourself as you navigate this human experience. You're worth it.